So you should have, if you're in my class, already watched the previous lecture about Gothic art where I was talking about Gothic art and architecture in France. So today we're going to talk about Gothic architecture and art in England and the Holy Roman Empire, which now is Germany. Okay, so let's skip through all the stuff about France that we talked about last time. Flying buttresses, rib vaults, hot Jesus, all the things. Okay. Renaissance style, flamboyant style. Paris is the city of lights because it's the city of illumination, not because of the lights. Okay, here we go. So now let's talk about what's going on in England. Okay, so there are some differences within Gothic art and architecture depending on what region the work is being done in. There are some stylistic differences and some structural differences. So let's start by looking at England. We're going to look at Salisbury Cathedral in Salisbury, England. If you ever go to Stonehenge, which we talked about back in the Neolithic part of the semester, Salisbury's right there, so you might as well hop over and go see a great example of English Gothic architecture. Oh, excuse me. So the English take on Gothic architecture tends to follow more of a linear pattern, and there's a little bit of more of an there's more of an emphasis on the horizontality instead of the verticality of the structures. So for example here, this building was built in 1220, begun in 1220, the same year as Amiens in France. So when we were looking at Amiens, remember it was 144 feet high, it was very vertically oriented, everything was made to look very, very tall. So here we don't have as much of that. You'll notice we have very sparing use of flying buttresses, very few buttresses. You can see a few. There's one right over there, there's a couple over here, but not very many. The facade screen, which is up here in the front, so headed kind of away from us over there, is wider than the height of the front of the building, so it really is kind of pulling it downward. The emphasis here is not so much on westwork. We don't have as much of the two towers and the westwork and the facade. The emphasis is on the crossing tower, and that's the tower that's built up over where the nave and transept cross and create the crossing, right? So let's look at the inside. This does look very Gothic to us, right? So we have our ribbed groin vaults all the way down the nave. We have our bundled columns and our colonnade. We have pointed arches. We have a clerestory and elevation, but you'll notice there's not as much glass, right? And part of that is we don't have all the flying buttresses to support it, and two, the glass that is there isn't as saturated. It's not as richly colored as the stained glass that we see coming out of the Gothic in France. Let's look at another English example. So this is Gloucester Cathedral in Gloucester, England. It's a little bit later, but again, you can see some structural similarities here. We have a crossing tower, that's the emphasis again here, rather than strong westwork. We have very few flying buttresses. One of the stars here at Gloucester are the cloisters. So we've talked about cloisters, particularly in the Romanesque. And here we see a great example of the perpendicular style. So this is something that is very British. There are a few examples where it pops up in other areas, like in Germany, that we're going to look at. But this perpendicular style, these kind of fan vaults where we have this really highly decorated stone carving that has nothing to do with the structure underneath, it's just purely decorative. This is very much a attribute of the English Gothic. Okay, so we have some other views here. You'll notice there's a lot of clear glass, not as much of the stained glass. This is in the main nave, and you'll notice that we have more of this kind of fan work. Here's a close-up where you can see more examples of that work. And again, this doesn't have any structural purpose, it's just decorative. And then also at Gloucester, we have the tomb of Edward II, which was actually commissioned by Edward II while he was still alive. And this is where we see kind of the onset of the Perpendicular style, the kind of beginnings of the Perpendicular style. Okay, let's look at a very iconic building in Europe. We have Westminster Abbey, very, very famous. So we're not going to look at that entire structure. We're just going to look at this particular chapel. This is the Chapel of Henry VII. You'll notice we do have some flying buttresses here, though they're pretty engaged with the building. They aren't quite as dramatic as some of the ones that we see in the French Gothic. We have our spires all the way around. We have some nice kind of fenestration work. We have pointed arches all the way around. And this adjoins again to Westminster Abbey, which is in London. It was designed by Robert and William Virtue. And we have this kind of look inside that's almost like architectural embroidery. So we have, again, these fan vaults. These have these points that come down off of them, these long hanging pendants that kind of remind me of the Mercanis that we looked at Alhambra when we were studying Islamic art. So you remember in the dome, these kind of structural, these design elements that would come down. So it's sort of similar looking to this. So again, we have this Perpendicular style, very much a British thing. We have a dissolution of the structural Gothic into this sort of decorative fantasy. So a lot of the decorative elements in the French Gothic have some kind of purpose, like the flying buttresses and things like this do have a structural purpose. And these are merely decorative. Here's a better view of that entire ceiling, which is pretty incredible. It's really something to see. Here's just another view. Also, you can see all the niche sculptures all the way around, and we again are having sculpture that's becoming more and more in the round, more and more independent from the wall, just like in the French Gothic sculpture that we were looking at in the previous lecture. Okay, let's hop over to what is now Germany, what was at this time in the Gothic era, the Holy Roman Empire, right? So if you think back to when we were talking about Charlemagne, when we were talking about Carolingian and Ettonian architecture, that still has a strong lineage when we're in the Gothic period. Okay, so this is Cologne Cathedral. In terms of everything that we've been talking about this semester, this is of the places that I've been to that I get to teach you about. This is one that I've been to most recently. When I was in graduate school, I was studying in Germany in 2017 and visited this cathedral and spent quite a lot of time there. It's pretty rad. It's really massive, which seems very obvious, but it feels massive. Like at Amiens or some of the other Reims, some of the other French, excuse me, large cathedrals we looked at, they have kind of an airy feel. I would not describe the Cologne Cathedral as airy at all. It feels, its mass is very present. So in the Holy Roman Empire, which is, you know, in this part of it is now Germany, it remained very stubbornly and conservatively Romanesque well into the 13th century. So they did not get on the Gothic train until fairly late, and they kind of had their own interpretation. Cologne Cathedral is the most similar to the French Gothic in Germany or in the Holy Roman Empire that there is, in my opinion. This cathedral was, they began construction in 1248. It's under the the direction of Gerhart of Cologne, and it's very Gothic and very a lot of familiar to us at this point, typical kinds of Gothic attributes. So you can see along the back tons and tons of flying buttresses, all very ornately appointed. We have our very large westwork. The westwork here is symmetrical. We have all of our pointed arches and pointed lancets. We have our exaggerated portal with the tympanum and all the sculptures, the jam sculptures. We have lots and lots of stained glass. So very Gothic. We have gargoyles, right? So very Gothic, very much in keeping with what we kind of know as Gothic now. This is also larger than any of the Gothic cathedrals we've seen. It's even larger than Amiens. Amiens, 144 feet high. This is 150 feet high at the choir. We have our double lancets in the triforium. We have a full triforium in the elevation along the nave. And this thing survived World War II. So there was fighting right up against this. It was hit directly in the fighting, and it's still standing and still in pretty good shape. It lost some windows that have been replaced, but it's kind of a beast. It's gorgeous and it's massive, and it really has stood up structurally to the test of time and to more than just wear and tear, to literal war being fought up against it. So it's pretty incredible. A couple more pictures, some pictures of the interior. So this is at the transept. You can see we have our ribbed groin vaults throughout and our pointed windows. There's some nice tapestry displays going on. Very typical Gothic interior. This is just another nice view. This is kind of a neat picture. So this is looking up into the spire and on one of the westwork towers. So you can see all that intricate stonework and all that open fenestration. And then this is a little aside. So I am a big fan of Gerhart Richter. He's a German artist who has done all kinds of work. He's done hyper-realistic painting. He's done abstract color field kind of painting. And in 2005, he got the commission, and then it was officially inaugurated in 2007. He was hired to create a stained glass window for Cologne Cathedral. So this window was, the medieval one had been replaced in the 1870s, I believe. There was a different window that was given as a gift to the German people by the King of Prussia. And then that window was destroyed in World War II. And so there had been some ideas about what to do about this, and there had been some sort of temporary windows put in and things, but the original medieval design, the designs for that were destroyed. They no longer exist, and the ones from the 1800s, also the designs no longer exist. So it was decided by, I think it was the Cathedral Commission, decided that they would hire an artist to make a new window that would be something new and singular and contemporary. And the person they hired is Gerhart Richter. And so he was presented with this challenge, and this is quite a large window. It's 106 square meters, and it was inaugurated on August 25th, 2007 as part of a Eucharist celebration. And so they present him with 800 different colors he can choose from of stained glass. It's all the kinds of stained glass that can be made. There are 800 colors. And he did a lot of research and found that there were 72 colors of glass that would have been available to the original medieval Gothic artists. So he chose those 72. And he arranged it in such a way that it would be this beautiful kind of abstract piece. And so it's really hard to capture in images. You really have to see it. But when the sun comes through, when the sunlight comes through this thing, it just plays against the stone, and it's incredibly beautiful. The light is really beautiful. It's a very controversial piece. About half the people really, really liked it, and half the people really, really didn't like it. I'm a big fan. I think it's pretty fantastic. And I just think it's a really, I think it's a really cool just to be honest about it. I think it's really cool to have such a contemporary piece utilizing techniques that are old or medieval and in this Gothic medieval setting. I think it's a really nice harmonizing of German cultural and artistic expressions throughout the years, and I'm a big fan. So anyway, I just wanted to share that with you. Okay, so this is St. Elizabeth. This is in Marburg, Germany. And you can see here that we have another example of a very German take on the Gothic. We have westwork with identical symmetrical towers. We have our pointed arches on our windows. This is quite heavy. It has a lot of engaged buttresses in the front westwork. And this is a Hallenkirche design, which is the German word for hall church. And remember, we've talked about hall churches before. A hall church is where the aisles are the same height as the nave, right? So you can see here we have the nave and then we have the aisles. And so there's a lot of light can come in when you have a hall church design. And all throughout the nave and the structure we have ribbed groin vaults, and we have our pointed lancet arches all the way. And this is up in the apse. So some fairly typical Gothic kinds of elements here, but again, because it's a hall church, we don't have a tribune, triforium, or clerestory because everything's the same height, right? Okay, this is a church designed by Peter Parler. It's Heiligkreuzkirche, which is the Church of the Holy Cross. It's in Schwabich, Germany, and you can see it's also a hall church. We can tell from the outside, right, that the nave and the aisles are the same height. We have some gargoyles on the outside. We have some pointy bits. We have some pointy arches. We have some rose windows. So we definitely have some Gothic embellishment, but it's quite different looking than a French Gothic church. And what I think is interesting about this is we see kind of a nod to the perpendicular style of England. So we have, instead of just regular ribbed vaults, we have a little bit more of a decorative exploration in the ribbed vaults and in the springing coming up from the columns here. So it's just kind of an interesting example of Gothic where we see a little bit of a different sort of influence happening here. Okay, and so the last thing that I'm going to leave you with in our Gothic section is just a look at this Piete. So this is the Rajon Piete. And so far in the Gothic, when we've been looking at sculpture, it's been heading more and more towards naturalism and looking back towards this classical kind of ideas about the realistic proportions of the body. We saw some more interest in human expression. And then in Germany, we have this sort of hard turn where it's there's more interest not as much in just naturalism, but in emotion and these ideas of showing particularly the suffering and agony of Christ and the grief and mourning of Mary. So this is the most extreme example of that kind of exploration where we have this just very disproportionate kind of unrealistic Pieta, but it's the emotional content is really the thing that is being examined the most closely here. And so we see this as kind of a direction that sculpture starts to take. So it's a pretty big contrast to some of the other sculpture that we've been looking at this time, where again we're seeing the development, the return to naturalism of the classical periods. But this is an interest in portraiture of individuals and also in emotion. So we have this kind of nightmarish looking thing that's humanizing, it's focusing on emotion, but we also have this stunted, distorted kind of wrecked body, right? And so the idea is kind of what is your suffering as a person compared to this, right? So that is to say that there's other perspectives happening in the Gothic everywhere. All right, it's been a great semester. Thanks for tuning in to my lectures, and your final exam will be posted this afternoon. All right, thanks everybody.